We are gathered here today to commemorate and to celebrate the Forgotten Rising. It was in this location on Easter Tuesday 1916 that the largest operation of the 1916 Rising outside of Dublin began. At about 7:20 in the morning, Liam Mellows and his band of about 100 volunteers laid siege to this building here behind me, which was the former RIC barracks here in Clarinbridge. They attacked the building for more than 3 hours, but the volunteers at the time, as we'll hear later, they were chronically unarmed. They were unprepared for an open confrontation with the militarized RIC that existed at the time in this country. And eventually, with the arrival of police reinforcements, RIC reinforcements from Culligan coming up the coast, they were forced to withdraw. Liam Mellows, he issued the order for them to withdraw, and they moved northwards towards Oranmore. This plaque here is dedicated to Harry Fahy, Father Harry Fahy, who was a local priest here in Clarinbridge in County Galway. He was an officer in the Irish Volunteers, and he provided spiritual support to the men of the Volunteers, to the Republican forces throughout Easter week here in County Galway as part of Liam Mellows' brigade. And we'll be hearing more about Father Fahy later. And so, coming up from Clarinbridge, the volunteers made their way up along this road right here. The company of volunteers under Mellows, and arriving here in Oranmore, they linked up with a unit of nearly 100 more Irish volunteers. These 100 men were under the command of Joe Howley, pictured here in the statue behind me. They had been attacking Oranmore barracks at that time, simultaneously to the volunteers' attack on Clarinbridge barracks. And now, with their forces linked up, the two forces under the command of Liam Mellows were now about to renew the assault on the barracks here in Oranmore. This is the remnant of the former RIC barracks in Oranmore, here behind me. It's now been converted into houses, but it was the barracks for the local RIC at the time. This new attack, renewed on the barracks after their forces had linked up, was much more intense. They cut the rail line to Athenry, and they damaged the bridge at the north of the town, and they blocked the roads also heading into the south. They attacked this barracks here for more than 6 hours. However, these volunteers were badly armed. This is something that we'll go into later, and they couldn't quite manage to take this installation. They captured multiple RIC prisoners. However, eventually, they had neglected to cut the Galway line, and RIC reinforcements arrived by train from Galway late in the evening, accompanied by reinforcements also from the army, from the Connacht Rangers Regiment. And Mellows made the decision at that stage, due to what was the superior firepower of the government forces, to withdraw his men once again. And this time they moved up the Athenry road towards a rally point near Moyode. All of the volunteers in County Galway were now moving towards the rally point to meet up with Liam Mellows and with the other volunteers. And the Castlegar and Clare Galway companies were assembling here at this crossroads at Carnmore when one of the most momentous incidents of the Easter Rising in Galway occurred. An RIC patrol were approaching this cross here in motor cars, and they stopped just short and they dismounted. They began to advance on foot. And one of the constables, it was a famous incident in the Rising, RIC Constable Patrick Whelan, he shouted out to the men, "Surrender, boys, I know ye all." He was shot instantly, and a vicious firefight ensued between the rebel forces who were here taking cover behind this wall and the RIC who had dismounted. Eventually, though the RIC attempted to outflank the Republicans, they were beaten back. They had to remount, and eventually they drove back up the way they came. There was an incredible spirit, a jubilant atmosphere among these victorious rebel troops at the time, and they marshalled themselves together and continued straight on towards Moyode to rally with Liam Mellows. And this is where they were headed. At the time in 1916, this site here was a model farm maintained by the Department of Agriculture for the sake of improving farming practices in the area. And this was the designated rally point for the Galway volunteers. Over the course of Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning, almost 700 men gathered here near Athenry in 11 companies comprising units from Derrydonnell, Kilconneran, Athenry, Cosson, Newcastle, Crockwell, Clarinbridge, Oranmore, Marie, Castlegar and Clare Galway. It was truly a massive force. It was an impressive achievement for the time, yet as previously mentioned, they were badly armed. They had between them only 25 rifles, 60 revolvers and 300 odd shotguns. Many of the men were carrying improvised weapons, hand grenades, hay forks and anything they could lay their hands on, and many more still were actually unarmed. Around noon on the Wednesday, Mellows held a meeting with his officers, and there was much dispute, there was much diasporiacht about what was to be done, what the next move was to be made. Mellows' men, by and large, were rural farming people. Their political ambitions included the redistribution of land that was controlled by the English lords at the time, and some of the local officers wanted to begin on this project immediately, seizing this land and giving it back to the people as a first priority. However, they were in the middle of an uprising, of a military campaign. Mellows could not be brought around to executing this plan of action immediately. However, those who are familiar with Mellows' later ideology will be able to see how his time spent among the people of Galway, among these people, would later influence his beliefs and his ways of thinking. Indecision reigned in the ranks of the officers with the volunteers here near Athenry. But ultimately, with Royal Navy artillery drawing within range of Athenry, Mellows issued another order to withdraw once again, this time in the direction of an estate near Moyode. The Nationalists encamped here in the vicinity of Moyode, on the grounds of an estate owned by an English lord. Cooking and medical work at that time was handled by the women of Cummin and Father Fahy gave absolution to volunteers who were going out on reconnaissance missions. They sabotaged the railway bridge at Crockwell and they set up various outposts around the perimeter of the area. A jubilant atmosphere reigned in the camp. There was nearly 700 of them gathered together here, volunteers from all across the East Galway. And they sang Thomas Davis's famous song, A Nation Once Again, around the campfires here on this site, in this area. But the situation was more precarious than it may have seemed. They were, as mentioned previously, ill-equipped. They had only a few weapons, and they truly weren't prepared for an open confrontation against the British Army. As for the British Army, they were moving to encircle the volunteers. A force of infantry, cavalry, artillery and armoured cars and machine guns had arrived at Athenry, having come from army bases in Loughrea. And with the situation growing increasingly hostile, volunteers slowly began to desert as the time wore on and as Easter week itself wore on without any clear orders or results. There was certain indecision in the camp, and there was truly a lack of action was the main issue which was affecting them at Easter week. And thus it was that on the Friday evening, Liam Mellows issued his final withdrawal order, this time moving southwards towards Ballynacdegia, Lime Park. By the time he departed, they had perhaps half of the original force left with them. And so the rebels retreated 15 miles southwards until they reached this estate, former estate behind me, right down there to my back left, down across the fields, Lime Park House. And on the Saturday morning, 4 days after Galway's forgotten rising began, the volunteers disbanded. Veteran Tom Concannon describes how Mellows was standing on the steps of the house as he watched the volunteers disperse. He wanted to head south into East Clare and form a flying column, but that idea was a bit too far ahead of its time. Ultimately, Mellows himself did end up going south, He was hidden in a safe house in East Clare for a number of months before he made his way to Cork and then Liverpool and eventually to New York City. But those who are familiar with this famous character and with Galway's Republican story will know that it was not the last that the county was to see of this man. County Galway was the site of the largest operation outside of Dublin during Easter week 1916. Though they did not succeed in their material aims, the volunteers here and nationally achieved something even greater. At the opening of 1916, the people of Ireland, by and large, were a population of contented slaves. The idea of a national revolution was dismissed, not only as impractical, but, worse still, ridiculous, unfashionable, backwards. The genteel, respectable, obsequious men of Ireland could not risk being slandered by the columns of the pro-government press. It was a lucky thing then for the Irish nation that the representatives of Irish Ireland had no interest in such obsequious servility. Thomas MacDonagh surmised the ethos of the rising when he said at his court-martial, "We do not propose to stand for the mass of the people of Ireland, but rather we stand for the intellect and for the immortal soul of Ireland." In their defiance, they achieved something greater than the removal of the British Army from this island. They achieved the exorcism of the foreign spirit from our island. They made Irishmen aware of their own native identity, and they exposed the absurdity of foreign rule. History is born from action, and this, the most noble action ever conducted upon Irish soil, returned history to an island that had formerly been, in the words of Cathal Brugha, Sáteang Aldachas. But this greatness has fled from us today. I won't dwell upon the failings of the present day, as you are already all well acquainted with these issues, but it's sufficient to say that the Republic of 1916 has not presently been achieved. And thus the nationalist recognises his duty. It would be wrong to account ourselves as listless individuals with no tether or bond to any objective structure floating through time and space. The educated Irishman recognises himself as the representative of a proud nation. A nation that exists still because in dark and evil days, men better than ourselves rose and fought for our self-determination. We owe it to them. You, if you dare to call yourself an Irishman this Easter week, owe it to them. To see their mission completed, their idea brought to power, for Ireland to be made a nation once again. Celebrate Easter, remember our patriot dead, and don't forget that it is down to all of us today to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain.